Welcome back to Echoes of Ihsan. We are diving deep today into Islamic jurisprudence, specifically the concept of blood money, as detailed in Muwatta Imam Malik, Book 43, Blood Money. It's a fascinating look at how Islamic law approaches compensation for injuries and even death. I think you might be surprised by how detailed and nuanced it gets.
You know, what's really captivating about this book is that it gives us this window into a legal system that really emphasizes reconciliation and, communal responsibility. When it comes to violence and harm, it really challenges us to think about justice in a whole different way than simple punishment.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're talking about blood money, Diyyah in Arabic. Can you break down,
Right.
what does this concept actually mean within Islamic law?
So at its core, right, Diyyah is a form of financial compensation paid to the victim or their family in cases of murder or injury. But it's not about revenge. It's not about retribution in the way we might typically think about it. Instead, it's about acknowledging the harm that's been caused, providing a tangible form of reparation, and really facilitating a path towards reconciliation between the parties involved, but also, importantly, within the community itself.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to think about justice. It's different than what we see in a lot of modern systems today. It almost sounds like what we might call restorative justice, where the focus is really on repairing the harm and restoring some kind of balance, rather than just punishing the person who committed the offense.
You've hit on a really key point there. The emphasis on reconciliation and communal responsibility is woven throughout this whole concept of Diyyah. And, that's actually reflected in the historical roots of the system. Did you know that some of the foundational principles of blood money were laid out by the Prophet Muhammad himself?
Oh, wow. So this goes back to the earliest days of Islam.
Exactly. The prime example is the Prophet's letter to Amr ibn Hasim. He actually outlines very specific compensations for various injuries. So this shows us how deeply rooted this concept is within Islamic tradition and how it connects to the core values of the faith.
So if we were to crack open this book, Book 43, what kind of details would we find about how the system actually worked in practice? I imagine it's got to be way more than just the general idea of financial compensation.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Book 73 gets very meticulous, very detailed, outlines specific injuries and their corresponding blood money values. So, for instance, loss of a life, obviously the most grievous harm, requires the payment of full blood money. And originally this was set at 100 camels, which reflects the very high value placed on human life. Later on, this was standardized to 1,000 dinars in gold or 10,000 dirhams in silver, depending on the regional currency. Now, these were substantial sums, underscoring the gravity of taking a life.
That's really fascinating. So it wasn't just a symbolic gesture, it was a real significant financial obligation. And I imagine that would have had a pretty powerful deterrent effect, knowing that causing someone's death carries such a heavy financial burden.
Precisely. The system was really designed to discourage violence, promote a culture of careful consideration for the well-being of others. Now for injuries that are less severe than death. There's a kind of sliding scale of compensation that Book 3 outlines. The more severe the injury, the higher the blood money. So for example, the loss of a nose, an eye, a hand, or a foot. Each of these has a very specific blood money value. What's really remarkable is how granular the system gets. It even assigns set compensations for individual fingers. And the key thing,
that level of detail is incredible. I think it speaks to the emphasis on fairness, proportionality. It's not just about throwing out random amounts of money. It's about carefully considering that specific harm and ensuring that the compensation truly reflects that harm.
Exactly. The system really aimed to strike a balance between addressing the needs of the victim, but also preventing excessive burdens on the responsible party. Think about, for instance, head injuries. The system recognizes that some wounds have a higher potential for long-term consequences. So a head wound that exposes the bone, or a wound to the brain, for example, would carry a higher blood money value than a more superficial injury.
That makes a lot of sense because it shows this understanding of the human body and the lasting impact of those types of injuries. So it's not just about the immediate physical harm, but about the potential long-term effect on the victim's life and well-being.
You've grasped a really crucial element here. It goes beyond just a transactional approach to compensation and delves into a more holistic understanding of harm itself. Now, there's another intriguing aspect of the system that we should probably talk about, and it's something that might raise some eyebrows today. The value of blood money could actually differ between men and women in some instances.
Oh, really?
Okay.
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that?
Certainly. For injuries that fall within the first third of the full blood money value, a woman receives the same compensation as a man. However, For injuries that exceed that threshold, the maximum a woman can receive is half the blood money of a man.
Okay, that is a significant difference. I'm curious. What was the reasoning behind this distinction?
That's a great question, and it's actually been a subject of a lot of debate and discussion among scholars. Throughout history, some interpretations point to societal norms of that time, where men often held primary roles as breadwinners, financial providers. So in this context, the difference in blood money was seen as reflecting a difference in potential earning capacity. However, it's important to acknowledge that this interpretation has been contested and viewed through different lenses over time. It's a complex issue, and one that highlights the evolution of legal thought and societal values.
Yeah, it definitely adds a layer of complexity. It reminds us that these laws were created in a very specific historical and social context, and understanding that context is key to really studying them.
Absolutely. And it invites us to think about, how our own systems today might reflect current power dynamics and social values.
So we've seen that the calculation of blood money can be very precise.
Hmm.
But is it always just a matter of looking up an injury and finding its value?
Well, that's where it gets even more fascinating. The calculation of blood money isn't always so straightforward. There are actually several factors that can influence the final amount.
Okay, so there's no simple lookup table. What kind of factors are we talking about?
Well, one of the most significant factors is intentionality. Accidental death or injury leads to the payment of blood money. However, intentional murder, deliberately taking a life, that can lead to a different outcome. In those cases, the principle of qisas comes into play.
Oh, can you explain what qisas means? I'm not familiar with that term.
Of course, qisas means retaliation or equal retribution, essentially. It means that the family of the victim has the right to demand the life of the murderer as a form of justice. But even in cases of intentional murder, Islamic law emphasizes forgiveness and reconciliation, so the victim's family always retains the right to choose to accept blood money instead of pursuing retaliation.
That's an interesting element. It acknowledges the magnitude of the harm, but it still offers this path towards healing and moving forward. It seems like it's really trying to prevent those cycles of revenge that we see that can tear communities apart.
You've got it. It's about offering a path towards justice that prioritizes reconciliation, even in the face of the most grievous harm. And it recognizes the human capacity for both wrongdoing and forgiveness.
So intentionality is a big factor. Are there any other factors that can come into play when determining the amount of blood money?
Absolutely. Another factor is the status of the victim. Now, this is a concept that we need to approach with sensitivity and an understanding of the historical context. So during the time period when these laws were developed, societies had very different social structures than we do today. And the concept of status encompassed various social categories, including religion and freedom. For example, the blood money for a free Muslim was higher than for a non-Muslim.
Right, that reflects the social hierarchy, the power dynamics of that time. It's a reminder of how societal values and structures influence legal systems.
Exactly. Studying these historical systems allows us to kind of unpack these complex interplays of social forces and legal principles. And it encourages us to examine, how our own systems today might reflect current power dynamics and social values.
So we've talked about intentionality. We've talked about the victim's status. Are there any other factors?
There's one. It might surprise you. Pregnancy. If a pregnant woman is killed, the blood money actually includes compensation for the fetus as well. This reflects the recognition of the potential life that's been lost. The compensation for the fetus is calculated as 1/10 of the woman's blood money value.
Wow, that's incredible. It shows this sensitivity to the potential for life and the tragedy of its loss. It goes beyond just acknowledging the harm to the woman herself, but recognizing the loss of a potential future.
Yes, it's a testament to the system's effort to really encompass a holistic view of the harm caused and to provide just compensation for all those who are impacted. Now, there's one final detail that speaks to the intricacies of the system. It even took into account the varying values of slaves. So if a slave was injured, the compensation was not paid to the slave themselves, but to their owner. And the amount was determined by the decrease in the slave's market value due to the injury.
Right. That's definitely a stark reminder of the realities of that era where slavery was an accepted part of society. And it's hard to reconcile that with our modern values.
It is. But as we analyze these historical systems, I think it's crucial to approach them through a historical lens. We can dissect their complexities, we can learn from them without condoning or ignoring the practices that were prevalent in those times.
Absolutely. Understanding the context, the key, both to appreciate the sophistication of the system,
Yeah.
but also to critically examine its shortcomings. In light of, our modern understanding of human rights and equality, it's a reminder of how far we've come as a society and the need to constantly strive for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. We've delved into the mechanics of how blood money is calculated, but I think it's crucial to move beyond the purely monetary aspect and really explore the broader implications of the system. What stands out to you about
The potential impact of blood money on the social fabric of the community.
Well, what strikes me is the strong sense of accountability. It's not just about punishing an individual,
Yeah.
but recognizing the role of the community, both in causing and addressing harm. That's a great observation. The system placed responsibility not only on the individual who caused the harm, but on their tribe, their extended family. They shared the burden of paying the blood money. This reinforced a sense of collective responsibility for the actions of their members, and it created a powerful incentive for communities to promote peaceful conduct and to discourage violence within their ranks, because they knew that acts of violence wouldn't just impact the individual, but could have broader consequences for the entire group.
Almost like a built-in system of checks and balances, encouraging communities to police themselves and maintain order from within. It's really fascinating how these legal mechanisms can shape social behavior and dynamics.
It's a great example of how law doesn't exist in isolation, but is deeply intertwined
with the social fabric
of the community.
Yeah.
And if we connect this idea of communal responsibility to the bigger picture, it becomes clear that the system was also very strategically designed to prevent those cycles of revenge that can be so destructive.
Ah, I see what you mean. So instead of allowing this tit-for-tat escalation of violence, the blood money system offered a structured way to address the harm and move towards some kind of resolution. It creates this framework for reconciliation and restoration of peace within the community.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's about channeling the understandable desire for justice into a system that promotes healing and social harmony, rather than perpetuating violence and animosity.
So in a way, it's a legal framework that prioritizes communal well-being, long-term stability over purely punitive measures. It's about finding a way to move collectively, even in the face of tragedy and loss. Really a different way of thinking about the role of law in society.
Exactly. And the intricacies of this system, the meticulous calculations, the various factors that are taken into account, all of this points to a very sophisticated approach to justice and legal reasoning within Islamic jurisprudence.
It's not just arbitrary punishments, but this carefully thought out system designed to achieve very specific social goals.
Precisely. And there's a wonderful element to this book that brings these principles to life. Book 43 shares real-life cases from the time of Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph of Islam. And these stories demonstrate how these principles were actually applied in practice, offering us this fascinating glimpse into the legal landscape of the time.
It's always interesting to see how the theoretical concepts play out in the real world. It helps to bridge that gap between, abstract principles and the lived experiences of people who are actually navigating these legal systems. What kind of insights can we gain from these real-life cases?
Well, some of the cases presented in the book really showcase the complexities that arose when applying these seemingly clear-cut principles to real-life situations. For instance, there were cases where the intentionality of an act was difficult to determine, leading to legal debates and discussions about how to apply the principles of blood money versus qisas. Other cases involved disputes over the value of blood money based on the specific circumstances
of the injury
or the social status of the individuals involved.
So it highlights the challenges of applying these principles in a nuanced and equitable way.
Exactly. And they also give us this glimpse into the evolving legal discourse of the time, as scholars and judges grappled with the complexities of applying these principles to a diverse range of circumstances.
Yeah, it's a reminder that law is never static. It's a dynamic process that adapts and evolves in response to the challenges and complexities of human society.
You've captured a key insight. And by studying these historical systems, I think we gain a deeper appreciation for the richness and the diversity of legal thought throughout history and across different cultures.
And perhaps we can glean some wisdom from these systems as we grapple with our own challenges of justice and accountability in the modern world.
Indeed, the past can offer valuable insights and perspectives as we navigate the complexities of the present and strive to create a more just and equitable future. As we've seen, this blood money system was so detailed, so complex. It really wove together legal principles, social customs, economic considerations. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's like a tapestry woven from these threads of tradition. practicality, and this deep respect for human life.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's that complexity that makes it so fascinating to study, It's a glimpse into this whole other way of thinking about justice, accountability. It challenges a lot of our modern assumptions.
It does. It makes you wonder, if a system like this, with its emphasis on financial compensation, communal responsibility, could it offer any insights for modern legal systems today?
That is a thought-provoking question. You see, modern legal systems, they often prioritize punishment, retribution. They focus on the offender, the crime itself, and sometimes I think they overlook the needs of the victim and the wider community.
Right. It's like the focus is on assigning blame, exacting punishment, rather than, healing that harm, restoring balance.
Exactly. Blood money, on the other hand, prioritizes making amends. It's about restoring equilibrium, acknowledging the harm, and creating this path forward for everyone involved.
Yeah. It sounds like a much more holistic approach, maybe a more restorative approach compared to, the adversarial nature of a lot of our modern legal systems.
Precisely. Now, I'm not saying that we should just transplant the blood money system wholesale into our modern context, but I do think there are some valuable lessons to be learned here, ideas that we might be able to adapt, integrate, to address some of the challenges we face today.
That makes sense. So what specific aspects do you think it could be relevant, applicable in a modern context? What can we learn from this? Ancient wisdom.
Well, one that really stands out to me is the emphasis on communal responsibility. Imagine if our communities took a much more active role in addressing crime, supporting victims, supporting offenders even, and working toward restorative solutions.
It's like shifting the focus from individual blame to this idea of shared accountability. Instead of just isolating the offender, you involve the community in that process of healing, reconciliation.
Precisely. And this could lead to more effective crime prevention strategies, stronger social cohesion. If communities feel a shared responsibility for addressing harm, they're more likely to be proactive in preventing it. It fosters this sense of interconnectedness, shared responsibility for the well-being of all members.
And that concept of communal responsibility, it ties in so well with, I think, the growing interest in restorative justice practices that we see today, this movement toward approaches that focus on repairing harm, bringing victims and offenders together, finding ways to make amends.
Right. Restorative justice programs. They often involve these facilitated dialogues between victims and offenders, allowing them to share their experiences, to understand the impact of the crime, and work together toward a resolution that addresses everyone's needs. It's about acknowledging the humanity of both the victim and the offender.
It's a powerful contrast to the often, impersonal, adversarial nature of traditional legal proceedings, where it's all about proving guilt, assigning punishment.
Indeed. And this emphasis on healing and restoration, it aligns perfectly with the principles at the heart of the blood money system. It recognizes that justice requires more than just punishment. It requires addressing the harm, acknowledging the pain, and finding a way to move forward collectively.
Another aspect I find really interesting is the focus on financial compensation, even for very serious offenses. Makes me wonder if financial compensation could have a more significant role in our modern criminal justice systems, particularly in cases where maybe the offender doesn't have the means to provide other forms of restitution, or where the harm caused has a very real financial impact on the victim.
That's a really insightful point. In many modern systems, financial compensation, it's largely relegated to civil cases. But the blood money system, it shows us that financial restitution can play a role, even in the most serious offenses, like murder. It forces us to consider whether there might be situations where financial compensation could contribute to a more just outcome, especially when
imprisonment alone may not fully address the harm. It challenges us to think more creatively about how we approach justice and consider a wider range of tools and approaches for addressing harm and promoting healing. Of course, any discussion about expanding the role of financial compensation would have to come with, careful consideration of the potential challenges, ethical implications.
Absolutely. I mean, one concern that immediately comes to mind is the potential to exacerbate existing inequalities.
Right.
If financial compensation becomes this primary tool for achieving justice, we have to be very careful that it doesn't create a system where wealthy individuals can essentially buy their way out of accountability.
Especially for serious crime.
Right, any system that
That's nice to be
incorporates
on the
financial compensation needs to have robust safeguards in place
Yeah.
to prevent those kinds of injustices. And to make sure it doesn't just perpetuate existing societal disparities, we need to be mindful of the impact on marginalized communities who might be disproportionately impacted by crime and who may lack the resources to navigate a system that prioritizes money. Exactly, equity and fairness have to be at the forefront of any such considerations. And I think we also need to be mindful of the cultural context. The blood money system, it's rooted in Islamic principles and traditions. So any attempt to adapt or integrate aspects of it into other cultural contexts, it would require careful consideration of the values, the beliefs, the legal frameworks of those societies. It's not about imposing a foreign system, but about drawing inspiration from its principles.
Yeah, it's about engaging in this thoughtful, respectful dialogue,
Right.
recognizing the potential benefits, but also the potential pitfalls of adapting concepts from one cultural context to another.
Precisely. It's a complex conversation, but it's a conversation worth having. The blood money system, with its emphasis on reconciliation, communal responsibility, restorative justice, it offers this really unique perspective that could enrich our modern understanding of law and justice.
The reminder that there are so many different ways to approach these very complex issues, and that we can learn from the wisdom of other cultures and traditions as we try to create a more just and equitable world.
Beautifully said. And it highlights the importance of studying history, not just for the sake of knowing the past, but for the insights it can offer into the challenges of the present and the possibilities for the future.
It's like looking into a mirror, but one that reflects a different version of ourselves, a different set of priorities, a different way of thinking.
And those reflections can be so powerful. They challenge us to question our assumptions, to consider alternative perspectives, to imagine new possibilities for how we approach the pursuit of justice in our own societies.
It's a journey of exploration and discovery, both of the past and of ourselves.
You know, exploring this system has been really eye-opening for me. To see the depth and complexity of Islamic jurisprudence, it's not just a set of rules, it's like a framework for navigating life's challenges in a way that aligns with these core spiritual values.
It's definitely been a journey for me, too, into this legal landscape that's so different from our own. Yet with principles that really resonate, it makes you realize that the quest for justice is something universal, even if the approaches are very different, across cultures and time periods.
Absolutely. It's a testament to human creativity, ingenuity, in developing systems that address harm, promote accountability, maintain order. And you know, for those listening who want to learn more, I highly recommend checking out Book 43 of Muwatta Imam Malik.
Oh yeah, it's a treasure trove of information. You'll find so many fascinating details about the blood money calculations, real-life case studies, the evolution of legal thought within the Islamic tradition.
It's a journey into a different time, a different world, and yet, as we've seen, it can illuminate our own systems and inspire new ways of thinking about justice.
Speaking of perspectives, there's one more thing I think we should touch on. We talked a lot about the legal and societal aspects, but what about the human impact, the emotional toll on the people involved in these situations?
That's such an important point, one that's often missed. In these discussions about legal systems, we get so caught up in, the mechanics, the principles, and we forget about the human hearts at the center of it all, to consider the weight of these decisions, the impact on people's lives.
Yeah, imagine having to accept blood money for the loss of someone you love. Can any amount of money truly compensate for that? Or on the other hand, the burden of paying blood money, even if the harm was accidental.
Those are profound questions, and there are no easy answers. It raises all these questions about the limits of financial compensation when it comes to emotional pain and how to balance justice with forgiveness and healing. For some, accepting blood money might feel like a betrayal of their loved one's memory, while for others, it could be a necessary step towards closure and moving forward. And for those paying blood money, it could serve as a constant reminder of the harm they caused, even if unintentional, the lasting impact of their actions.
Right, it reminds us that true justice, it requires more than just these transactions, financial transactions. It demands empathy, understanding, a real effort to repair those broken bonds within families and communities.
Well said. It's about recognizing those emotional and spiritual dimensions of justice. The need for compassion, the search for reconciliation, that goes beyond just the legal aspects.
I think that's a really powerful takeaway. from our exploration of the blood money system. This ancient system reminds us of that
Duh.
enduring human quest for justice and the very complex nature of healing and reconciliation.
It does, and it highlights the importance of studying history, not just for understanding the past, but for the insights it can give us into the present, the future, for the challenges we face today.
It's been a truly thought-provoking dive into a different way of thinking about law, justice, and the human experience, and I hope our listeners will be inspired to explore these concepts further, to think about how our own legal systems could evolve to better address the complexities of harm and the pursuit of a more just.
I couldn't agree more. The pursuit of justice is an ongoing journey, and we can all learn from the wisdom of the past as we work toward a better future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll be back next time with another exploration of these fascinating topics. Until then, when